Hello, and welcome to my talk on how AIs could be learning inconsistent human values. The talk will alternate between seeing things from the AI's perspective and looking at quite how inconsistent human values are. These interact because the easier we have, or the better understanding that we have of inconsistent human values, then the easier it is to program them into an AI. So let's start with just a sort of case study. This is a case study that would be given to a theoretical AI that, in the spirit of inverse reinforcement learning, would have observed humans and would have inferred human preferences from the observations that it made. So it's done that, and now it is confronted with a person X who is stuck in an abusive relationship. If someone tricks or forces them out of this relationship, X will protest initially, but will soon come to agree that that was the best decision. If they are left in the relationship, then they will suffer a lot, but come to be more and more attached to their abuser. Now, the question that humans want to ask in this case is, was it the right thing to do, whatever the AI ends up doing, intervening, not intervening, doing something else entirely? But the more correct question, or more interesting question, is how do we reward the AI for its decision? If we model the AI as a reinforcement learner, it makes a decision, then presumably there needs to be a reward behind it, something that motivated it to do one or the other. So what is the correct reward here? How will we establish this reward? And it's not as if we can give it by hand in every single case where this might come up. So other designs, like other algorithms, have similar questions. I'm going to focus on the reward learners, or the reinforcement learners, but other designs have the same thing. How does a sort of more standard algorithm decide which course of action to take? How does it weigh them? And this way of thinking, always of not what is the right thing, but how do we reward the AI for doing the right thing, clarifies a lot of issues. Now, I'm going to focus on agents that have no values, which humans are to some extent, as we'll see. But this is clearly an agent without any values. So there are two reward functions or utility functions or something in the world, R0, R1. They may be counting the number of, I don't know, candles and forks or whatever. And there's a button B, and if you press it, you increase whatever R0 is, and there's a button not B, and if you press it, you increase whatever R1 was. And we have an agent, H, very simplified, and it presses B initially, again and again and again. But there's another button, delta, completely independent, and if that one is pressed, then H starts pressing not B instead. So the question, this is the full descriptive algorithm of H. It encapsulates and defines the agent entirely. So the question is, what are H's values? It's rather tricky to figure out what they are. There are three obvious candidates. H could be an R0 maximizer that is then have its preferences overwritten by delta. It could be an R1 maximizer who is liberated by delta to focus on what it really wants, or it could have a sort of more complicated mixed value system that it wants to maximize R1 if delta is pressed and maximize R0 otherwise. But all of these values are assignments that we make to the agent, because the agent, it's clear what it is, it's clear what it does. And so and nowhere do actually any of these expressions appear internally. So the question of assigning it value is really assigning it or building its value. And thus the process of figuring out the human value function is, I will argue, the process of building a human value function subject to certain constraints that make it acceptable. It is not a process of figuring out the genuine human value function, because there is no genuine human value function hiding in our brains. We are a mass of neurons. There is no R0 lying somewhere there, which we can just look at and say, aha, there it is. but we may be able to do better than just sort of guessing. Here is a model of how AIs may model the irrationality in the humans. As we'll see, this can only capture part of human irrationality, but it'll get a decent chunk, hopefully. So curly H is a set of histories. So these are the past histories, the things the agent, the human, has experienced. R is a set of rewards, the potential human reward functions, and A is a set of actions that the humans can take. Big pi is the set of policies. Policies are maps from histories to actions. So if you've experienced this history, you take this action. And little pi h is the human policy. You should note that the human policy is something that can be observed and deduced from observation. It is, if you look inside the brain especially, you can figure out what humans will do. So just take a single human in this case, what a single human will do in any circumstance or given any history, and this allows you to reconstruct the human algorithm or the human policy, or at least you can approach this perfection in the limits. This is what observations tend to. We have an irrationality model, M, which basically says how the human is going about maximizing their reward. So it is a map from rewards to policies. It's one rationality model that is often used in papers is assume the human or the agent is fully rational. Then if you give the reward, you plug it in, and the policy is the policy that best maximizes this reward and expectation. That's a common irrationality model. It's, in fact, the only rationality model in there. But there are a lot of others dealing with bounded rationality and a whole host of other human biases that we're not all that good at maximizing these things. So a pair, MR, are said compatible if M of R is the human policy. So if an agent with this rationality model following this reward would behave exactly as the human would. Here are some examples. The first one, the assumption that humans are fully rational. And you can fit a very complicated reward function to this assumption to explain human actions. There is a very complicated reward function that will fit, that is compatible with human rationality, and will explain it. But you might have to go into very fine details for each particular action. You might need a special reward for that special circumstance that it comes up, but it is possible. Here's another one. Humans are fully anti-rational. We have all the reasoning abilities of the fully rational ones, but we always end up choosing the worst action because we're so incompetent at action choosing. In that case, it's clear that this M2 of minus R1 is the human policy, minus where R1 is the one that corresponds with the rational model. Here's another one where the reward is irrelevant. M3 maps to the human policy whatever the reward is. We can shove in a very simple flat reward function, for instance, and it'll go to the perfect human policy. And now let's assume that we've found a true, in quotes, model MR pair for human rationality. True meaning basically a safe, adequate, or acceptable assignment of rationality and reward. Well, here's an M4, which is just minus that M, i.e. it maps minus R to where M4 maps minus R to where M maps R. So M4 of minus R is again just the human policy. Now, what do we think of these four pairs of irrationality rewards? Well, they're all compatible, and it is a trivial truism that if a model perfectly predicts human behavior, then you cannot show it to be wrong by looking at human behavior, because it perfectly predicts it. What that means is that if we need to distinguish between these four options, we cannot do it by observing human action, and hence by observing anything else, because they are fully compatible. So what this means is that pi h is an observable fact about the universe, but the fact, therefore, that M-R pair must be compatible is also the case, but the decomposition into M and R is not an observable fact. This is, in a sense, the Humean is versus ought question, brought again in, well, not again, but brought here into a reward learning form. Now, the first thing that I'd hoped here is that maybe Kolmogorov complexity might be able to save us. For instance, in the first case, the R1 reward is immensely complicated, though the M1 is trivially easy. Unfortunately, Kolmogorov will not save us. The M1-R1 pair is about as complicated, if not simpler, than any true candidate we could do. There's a sort of mathematical results that I did there. In fact, the worst case, in a sense, is M4, because what that means is if we do have a good or true candidate, there is another candidate that is the opposite of that, and it is 2 minus signs longer. So Kolmogorov complexity is barely bigger. So Kolmogorov complexity cannot be used. In the case of 1 or 2, the rationality models are very simple and the rewards are very complex. In the case of M3, the irrationality module is immensely complicated and the reward could be trivial, and in fact could be 0. But this is just shifting the complexity around. It does not actually make the pair more complex. So, having got this model, I'm going to then explore the limits of it and see where examples where it fails. My ambition is to extend this model to incorporate the more complicated human irrationalities that we're going to explore, and also other aspects which we'll see in a few more slides. So the first problem is that humans don't have single values. We can be modeled in large part as different subagents clashing in our brains who have the upper hand at different times. Sometimes one is successful and we overcome temptation, sometimes we give in to temptation, and then we have other things that sort of sketch a narrative between various different urges and preferences. But here's a very simple case. Suppose a human does not know whether they want to live forever. Their long-term preference is that they feel they shouldn't live more than a century. That would be unreasonable or unnatural. However, they have a short-term preference that they want to live to the next year. And this short-term preference is normally one that they're going to keep having every single year. So at the time that they turn 99, there is a predictable contradiction between their long and short-term preferences. Again, this could be about dieting versus eating delicious cakes. And this is a kind of challenge that's quite common amongst humans. Now, this human is about to meet with one of two philosophers, and the AI is doing their schedule. They're either going to meet with R.T. Long, who will convince them to embrace the long-term preferences and hence live no more than a century, or they may meet with Paul Kurtz, who will convince them that their short-term preference should be extended, and this should overcome it, and they are open to indefinite survival, if possible. Now, after talking with either of them, they will reconcile their long-term and their short-term preferences, and from then on, they will not change them, even if they meet the other philosopher at a later date. Once they've made that decision, it's basically irrevocable. This is a relatively realistic view of many humans in many circumstances when they encounter arguments or issues or contradictions they had not seen before. You can get it in politics and philosophy and other things like that. The problem here is that the AI, by setting the agenda, just a small task, is setting the human's long-term preferences or reconciling them in the short-term ones. It is determining how humans resolve their contradictory preferences. This means, and since there are so many different contradictory urges within humans, this AI, if it's knowledgeable enough, has immense power for determining what our preferences ultimately are through very simple, non-coercive, helpful actions. Now, one thing we could do is we could appeal to meta-preferences. Maybe meta-preferences are always go for your long-term preferences, or always go to the most popular preference amongst your peer group, or always go for the one endorsed by the most philosophers, or some other thing, or maybe some collection of meta-preferences with different weights. This could be a way of resolving this, though I want to point out that human meta-preferences are often even more inconsistent than lower-level preferences, but sometimes they're not. But meta-preferences cannot be captured in the model that I presented earlier. So that's the first candidate for extending the model. Beyond not having single values, the problem is that humans don't really have proper values. Our values are not really just about states of the world, or at least not trivially or not easily. Here are two more examples. The first is of someone who believes in a God, flinches away from some atheist arguments, but believes that their God would prevent them from disbelieving, from going astray, if they did listen to that atheist argument, and presume that actually they're wrong. If they did engage with that argument, it would eventually undermine their beliefs. Now, what are the preferences here? This is a mishmash of beliefs, preferences over beliefs, and beliefs of preferences over beliefs. And this is not, I hope, an unreasonable or impossible situation for a human being to find themselves in. Another example, someone who believes that a balcony is stable, leaves it might fall. Leaves is a philosophical term, means that you feel that that's the case, but you know that you're wrong. So you have the feeling of height and of falling, but you know that you're safe. And they enjoy the feeling of danger. A similar case would be riding a roller coaster. For instance, people who go to roller coasters generally believe that they're very safe, or else they wouldn't go. However, we don't go to roller coasters to appreciate the view and to have a quiet, sedate meditation on how safe we are. So there's definitely a mixture of things going on here. There are also things like people have preferences over the beliefs of others. You have religious and some political movements that have that, but I think most people do, at least to a mild extent. Like, I certainly have the preference that people's beliefs be accurate, for one. So this is a mild preference. Maybe it's one that I would ultimately reject, but it is a genuine component of my current preferences. Now let's have a look again at how the AIs influence human values. We have formally that sort of long-term versus short-term. What happens is that the AI takes action A, as a consequence, the human takes action B. Or the AI takes action not A, and as a consequence, the human does not take B, but instead takes not B. There are some situations in which this is perfectly fine. If the AI puts your left shoe on, you will then put your right shoe on, and vice versa. If the AI gives you a drink of water, you will then not go and pour yourself a drink, and again vice versa. In those cases, there's no preference change whatsoever, in a sense. Then we have things that are presumably not okay, like if the AI hacks into your brain to rewire you into something completely different. This is presumably not okay with you. If the AI gives you a lot of heroin injections or things more targeted into your brain with hormones to manipulate you, again, this is presumably counting as overriding your preferences, not accomplishing them. And I just want to point out that the rationality model, the assumptions that humans are fully rational, in this case, would be fine with the brain surgery and your subsequent action. It would just say you have certain preferences conditional on being brain surged and others conditional on not being brain surged. There's nothing odd about that. However, it is clear that from many perspectives, in this case, this is either the death or at least the significant modification of the human involved. This is actually, and there are intermediate situations like when the AI can determine who you love with or who you fall in love with, and major life decisions like whether you have a child or not. And this can be incorporated into the model relatively easy, so I did. And what I did was extend the space of policies, whereas before the policies map from histories to actions, but also add a true or false value as to whether the human's rationality, whether the human's preferences have been overridden by outside action or not. You could imagine doing a continuous number between 0 and 1, but for the moment a Boolean will do very well. In this case, you could have a model of human rationality, which is that humans are rational, but brain surgery is overriding their preferences, for instance. Again, that would allow you to rule out certain options for the AI in influencing us. The fact that the AI can influence us is a big problem, because imagine that we have two models of human irrationality and two reward functions, and they're compatible. M and R are compatible, M prime and R prime are compatible. And M prime, R prime corresponds to the AI slashing into our brain and doing something very unpleasant. Since we are proper Bayesians, we don't want to give this a 0 probability. We're going to give it some very low epsilon. However, if the AI can slash into our brains and reset it to anything, then it may reset us to an R prime that is extremely easy to maximize. It could choose one so that the maximization of R prime, even when multiplied by epsilon, is way bigger than the maximization of R. Because it can choose what our future reward is, this sort of small probability thing opens the option to some variant of the Pascal mugging. Not exactly that, but the case of a small probability event overweighing all the others. And as a consequence, the AI, if it acts to maximize our preferences, and if there's an epsilon chances that the brain surgery that it wants to do does not change our preferences, and if those preferences afterwards are extremely easy to maximize, then this is the path that maximizing our preferences will push it down to. Now, we can do some things about that by, say, renormalizing R prime and R in some senses as the highest value you can get. So you can do stuff like that. It is a bit more tricky if R prime and R are the same thing. And in this case, is the action A an overwriting of human preference? And the module M says yes, it is. And the irrational module M prime says it is not. So with probability 1 minus epsilon, taking action A is an overriding of human preferences. But again, we get the same problem if the R conditional on A is much higher than the R conditional on not A. And because from the outside, this looks like the AI hacking us into something new, it is very possible that it can select an R conditional on A that is much higher than the R conditional on not A. And this is not so easy to renormalize when it's the same reward function and a disagreement as to whether one branch is rational or not. Because there are many situations where actually we would want the AI to push us in the branch where we get the higher reward in general. So we can't just renormalize every branch. So this is a challenge that needs to be addressed. So what do we need in practice to solve this assigning human values problems? Well, we need what's called safe, expansive normative facts. Pure observation is not sufficient. So we need normative facts that can combine with observations in order to hone in on a desirable irrationality or a desirable reward. The two are the same. If you cut out in one side, then the compatibility requirement cuts out possibilities from the other. Like a normative fact is humans are not fully rational when drunk. You can define what drunkenness is, and this is a useful thing for the AI to know. And if it has it, I mean, you might say, well, couldn't the AI know that anyway? Well, it doesn't know. It just observes that humans have different behaviors when drunk. Whether or not this is a rational or not behavior is an assignment or a judgment call that cannot be made by observation. But knowing that humans are not fully rational when drunk cuts out quite a lot of the possible M's. It cuts off the humans are always fully rational one for a start, and is definitely a useful one to have. If we want to cut from the reward side, we could say that humans do not enjoy feeling jealous. And therefore, it can conclude things when it starts seeing humans doing behaviors that will predictably lead to them feeling jealous later on. And they do not enjoy is taken in a normative sense, that this is a bad thing, that their rewards are not maximized in this situation. Then we could have what I call expansive normative facts. These are normative facts that imply a lot of other facts. For instance, you could say that the Wikipedia bias articles are accurate. There's a page there that links to all the bias articles, and you say that the ones here are accurate, expressed in human language. And this opens up a huge host. This is very expansive because it slices away so many different irrationality modules. It really cuts it down. A similar thing that cuts it down on the reward side is this part of the brain activates for pain, you pointed out. That itself is not yet normative, and pain is bad. It's the normative piece. So with this, and the R is very restricted, because pain or avoiding pain or things like that are an important component of human behavior. This often comes up. There's other things like people's relaxed decisions about their values are correct. Sorry, about their rationalities are correct. So if this is the case, then you can ask people about their own irrationality in relaxed circumstances to be defined, and this will tell you a lot about their rationality and hence about their values. From the other side, we have things like humans generally don't want to die. Again, very useful fact, and cuts out a lot of otherwise plausible rewards. The problem is that none of these are particularly safe. If we just take, for instance, the pain one, then we would transform the AI into a human pain minimizer, which would have devastating consequences. Humans don't want to die would transform it into a survival maximizer. And the relaxed preferences might transform it into some variant of a human speech-based human command obeyer. Again, all of these can result in very disastrous consequences. What we need are so-called safe collections of expansive normative facts. So expansive normative facts that together can expand and really define a reasonably small set of possible M and R that we can be confident in. Unfortunately, so far, these consequences are the I don't know and I don't have a clue. But there is some hope. If you look at the expansive normative facts above, they're not bad. It's just bad if they are on their own. Like humans generally don't want to die is very reasonable for some interpretation of generally. So if you take expansive normative facts that are sort of true, weigh them, make sure that the various Wikipedia articles, there's certain uncertainty, they might be wrong, they might be caveats and stuff like that. If you know how to weigh all these things and combine them together, you might be able to put together a safe collection of expansive normative facts and then use them as a basis with the knowledge of the human policy function to then get a safe or at least acceptable collection of possible human reward functions. So in summary, humans don't reveal their preferences well. Whatever our preferences are and how they're expressed, it is not an easy connection between them. Humans don't have single preferences. We have multiple preferences competing in each other. Humans don't have proper preferences. We have things like preferences over beliefs, beliefs over preferences over beliefs, preferences over beliefs of others, and things of that nature. AIs can choose among human preferences with great subtlety if need be. AIs can choose within human preferences. That was the branch where where the two rewards were the same. And this is a lot more tricky to counter, because if you choose among human preferences, you can renormalize, and if you choose within, it's not nearly so easy. And we need some safe, expansive normative facts to deal with this challenge. Now, but there is a final thought that I'll leave you with, which is, how do humans do it? We ourselves should model other humans in complete ignorance of their values or their rationalities. We could model them as perfectly rational and just a complicated reward function. Yet when we see somebody drop a vase or something like that, we don't say, oh, you wanted to drop a vase. We say you were clumsy, most of the time. So what is it that allows us to do this, at least within ourselves and towards others? So we have expansive normative facts that we are using. They may be hardwired, or they may be a product of our experience or something like that, but we have these. So there should be a way of getting these into AIs as well. In any case, that's the end of the talk, and thank you for listening.